What if I told you that right now, somewhere beneath your feet and spread across the open land in every direction you can see, there is enough raw material to heat your home through an entire winter, and the next winter after that, and the one after that, without spending a single dollar, without planting a single seed, without drilling into rock or negotiating with any supplier, without depending on anyone to show up at your door with a delivery? What if the people who cracked this problem weren't engineers with blueprints and university degrees, but sun-weathered men and wind-cracked women standing on the open plains of the American frontier, surrounded by nothing but grass, sky, silence, and a cold so deep it made iron groan? Think about that for a moment. No electricity, no insulated windows, no central heating system humming behind the walls, no fuel truck rolling down a paved road on a schedule, no weather forecast, no phone to call when the blizzard hit and everything went white and still. And yet, they were warm, not barely warm, not surviving by luck warm, genuinely, consistently, survivably warm, through winters that would freeze livestock solid in open fields, through nights that dropped so far below zero, the timbers of a cabin snapped like pistol shots in the dark. How? The answer will dismantle everything you think you know about heat, about fuel, and about what survival actually demands of a person. There is a cliché burned deep into the American imagination. The frontier settler, rugged and tireless, hauling wagon loads of firewood across impossible distances, splitting logs at first light with frozen breath rising in the pale air, feeding an insatiable fire through the night just to hold the cold back from the door. And that image is partly true. The labor was real. The cold was real. The danger was constant and utterly indifferent to human suffering. But here is the part nobody talks about. That cliché focuses entirely on the fuel. It assumes the fundamental problem was always about acquiring more of it. More wood, more coal, more of whatever could be burned. That was the surface problem. The deeper problem, the one the most successful frontier families actually solved, was something no one in the East was asking. Not how to generate more heat, but how to stop hemorrhaging the heat they already had. That shift in thinking changed the entire shape of survival on the plains. Imagine standing on the high plains of the Kansas Territory in the middle of February. The wind comes from the north. Steady, relentless, a dry blade that finds every gap in your collar and every seam in your boots. The sky is white, not the soft white of a gentle snowfall, but the hard, flat white of a sky that has forgotten what warmth feels like. The grass is gone, buried under a crust of ice that catches the pale sunlight and throws it back cold. Trees? There are no trees. There haven't been trees for 50 miles in any direction. The nearest cut timber is so far away that hauling it back, if you could haul it back through these conditions, would cost more in labor, time, and animal strength than most families could afford. This was not a temporary inconvenience. This was the permanent, immovable reality for hundreds of thousands of families who chose to settle the treeless stretches of the Great Plains. And they did not die in mass numbers. They did not abandon their claims and go back east, broken. They adapted. And what they built barely made sense on the surface, but worked with a logic so clean, so deep, that modern thermal engineers still study it. They built into the earth. The sod house, the soddy, as the settlers called it, looks primitive at first glance. Blocks of thick prairie grass, roots and all, cut from the ground like rough bricks, stacked into walls sometimes 3 feet deep. A roof of the same material, layered over salvaged timber beams or woven branches. Dirt floor. One small window if there was glass, or oiled paper if there wasn't. A low door. From the outside, it looked as if the earth itself had decided to grow a room. And that was exactly the point. The earth, that vast, patient, unstable thermal mass stretching in every direction for hundreds of feet, holds a temperature that almost never changes. Not frozen, not scalding, steady. The deeper you go, the more stable it becomes. The settlers didn't have words like thermal mass or passive insulation or heat retention coefficient. But they understood the concept with the precision of people whose survival depended on understanding it. The thick walls weren't merely barriers against wind. They were slow-release heat banks, absorbing warmth during the daylight hours and radiating it back through the night, hour by hour, invisibly and reliably. Here is where the real engineering begins, and where most people's mental model completely breaks down. The average sod house in the mid-1800s, Great Plains, used a fraction of the fuel consumed by a wood frame house of the same size. Some accounts from the period, journals and letters preserved in county historical archives, describe families burning nothing more than twisted bundles of dried grass on the coldest nights. Not because they had run out of better fuel, because the house itself was doing most of the thermal work. The walls were 3 feet of packed earth. The roof was sometimes 2 feet of sod. The floor was compacted clay. Every surface in contact with that structure was a thermal storage medium, then a slow and enormous battery that had been charging all day from whatever heat source was available. A small fire, body heat from the family, the weak winter sun angled through that single small window and was now releasing it steadily, hour after hour after hour. The fire didn't need to be large. The fire was never the primary source of heat. The building was. But here's the part that nearly every retelling of this story misses entirely. The fuel wasn't wood. Across vast stretches of the plains, the primary fuel source was something so common, so overlooked, so completely free that travelers from Europe wrote home about it with a mix of bewilderment and reluctant admiration. Buffalo chips, sun-dried animal dung. The plains were covered in them, deposited across the grasslands by the millions of bison that had ranged those territories for thousands of years, and later by the cattle herds that replaced them. Settlers collected them in baskets, in sacks, in aprons tied at the corners. They dried them through the warm months and stacked them in enormous piles against the sides of their homes, sometimes piles that rivaled the house itself in volume. A well-dried buffalo chip burned slowly, steadily, with a low and even heat and very little smoke. More efficient per unit than green wood, comparable in many respects to compressed peat. It required no tools to harvest, no animal to fell, no axe to split. You picked it up off the ground. And the plains provided them an effectively unlimited supply, self-replenishing season after season. No cultivation required, no planting, no management beyond the gathering itself. The fuel cost exactly $0. And when the thick sod walls did their job, that $0 fuel was more than enough to carry a family through the winter alive and warm. Nothing worked in isolation. The chips provided the heat. The walls stored it. The small window was oriented south, always south, in the designs that survived best. to catch the low-angle winter sun during the brief hours it appeared. The doorway was recessed, sometimes with a vestibule of stacked sod or a hanging buffalo hide, creating an airlock effect that slowed the exchange of warm interior air for freezing outside air every time someone passed through. The hearth was built from stone or clay, not from wood or metal, precisely because stone and clay absorb heat and release it slowly, while metal conducts it outward and loses it almost immediately. Even the way families arrange themselves within the space, sleeping near the hearth, working toward the center, storing food against the north wall where the cold was greatest, was part of the system. Every choice connected to every other. Remove one element, and the whole thing became measurably less effective. Keep them all, and you had a machine for staying warm that required almost nothing to run and cost almost nothing to fuel. Now here is the objection that always comes up, and it deserves a straight answer. Someone will say, "This sounds unpleasant. It sounds dark and cramped and dirty." The honest answer is, yes, it was. The sod roof leaked during rain, a slow cascade of muddy water that could persist for 2 days after a storm ended. The interiors were dim, the ceilings low, the air thick with the smell of earth and smoke and animals. There is no romanticism here. These were not cozy retreats. They were survival structures, built under pressure, maintained under stress, inhabited by people who were exhausted and frequently afraid. The trade-off was explicit: comfort for survival, exposure for endurance. The beauty of the system was not aesthetic, it was functional. And the families that committed to it, that understood what they were actually building rather than simply imitating what they remembered from the East, those families made it through. The ones who tried to build wood frame houses in the treeless plains with inadequate fuel supplies, driven by pride or convention or a refusal to adapt, often did not. Consider the scalability of what they built. A single person could construct a basic sod shelter in days using nothing but a breaking plow, a cutting spade, and their own labor. No lumber yard, no sawmill, no supply chain. The material was underfoot. The fuel was spread across the landscape in every direction. The techniques could be learned by watching a neighbor or reading a single-page circular passed from homestead to homestead. And once built, the structure required almost no external energy input to maintain its thermal performance. Well-built sod walls, kept dry and patched with clay when necessary, lasted for decades, and some sod houses on the plains were occupied for 20 or 30 years. The thermal performance didn't diminish over time. If anything, the walls compacted further and became even more efficient insulators as the seasons passed. The blizzard of 1888, called the school children's blizzard in the historical record, struck the northern plains on a January afternoon with almost no warning. Temperatures dropped 40 to 50 degrees in a matter of hours. Winds reached hurricane force. Visibility collapsed to zero. Hundreds of people caught outdoors died within sight of shelter they couldn't locate through the white wall of snow. And for days afterward, the cold held. Absolute, paralyzing cold. Livestock froze in open fields. Water pipes in the towns that had them burst and flooded streets that immediately turned to ice. And then, in the sod homesteads scattered across the affected territory, families survived. Not without suffering, not without cost, but the thermal performance of those earth walls, the low, steady burn of the buffalo chip hearths, the sealed door systems, the south-facing windows, the whole integrated system held. The families that had built correctly, that had connected every piece of the design instead of relying on a single element, made it through to the thaw. And when spring came, the fields around their homes were still covered in the raw material for the next winter's fuel. The plains had deposited it there, for free of charge, as they had every season for as long as anyone could remember. No planting required, no cultivation, no capital investment, just collection, drying, stacking. The cycle renewed itself without human management, season after season, decade after decade. That is the $0 frontier fuel hack. Not a trick, not a shortcut, not a single invention. It is a system, a deeply integrated, mutually dependent, thermally intelligent system built from materials that cost nothing, fueled by a resource that renews itself without any human intervention, and designed around a principle that modern building science has spent the last century slowly and expensively rediscovering. The goal was never to generate more heat. The goal was to stop losing the heat they already had. We build homes today with walls that are 4 inches thick and heat them with systems that cost hundreds of dollars a month to run. We have never been more technologically sophisticated, and energy insecurity has never been more widespread or more punishing for ordinary families. The pioneers didn't have our technology. They had something different, the absolute, uncompromising necessity of making every calorie of heat count. And that necessity produced a wisdom about mass, about storage, about orientation, about systems thinking that we abandoned when cheap energy made it seem unnecessary. It was never unnecessary. We just forgot why it mattered. And right now, in ways that feel uncomfortably familiar, we are being reminded. If this changed the way you think about heat, about survival, about the buried genius in the history of this land, hit subscribe and stay close, because the next story goes even deeper into what the frontier actually knew that we've spent a century pretending we didn't need.